So about 2/3 of the people that I've met here are desperately trying to hire the other 1/3, as far as I can tell, and complaining that it's very difficult to do. Can't seem to get people to come work for them. And I have the solution. The solution is to completely redesign the culture of your company to make it the most amazing place in the world to work for, and then people will beat down your door to work for you. Exactly how to do that is really the struggle that I've been going through for the last several years, trying to figure out how this works. And I have been chronicling this on the blog reinventingbusiness.com that you can see here. The images that you're about to see are paintings that I've done. So in 2009, I broke my leg skiing. It was really bad. It was about 3.5 hours of surgery, and there's metal in there and cadaver bone, and I was, completely under, and there was a lot of sitting around staring afterwards, and I started having thoughts and wondering about my career path. Because when I was a youth, I had several jobs that made me think that all work was terrible, and that I never wanted to work for anybody again because it was just a bunch of people telling me what to do and telling me when I had to have my butt in a seat and when I could go on vacation and all these things that I didn't want to do. So I decided I had to be a consultant. That became my life path. And during this recuperation period, I started wondering about that because I like interacting with people, but I gave that up to be independent. And so I started wondering, are all jobs really as bad as I thought that I had concluded in my callow youth? Maybe there are workplaces that don't suck that I would actually want to work with. They appear to be very rare because study after study comes up with this idea that maybe 50 to as high as 80% of people really don't like their jobs at all. They really just think of work in the same way that I did. You might know me, and it's like you're coming here and you're thinking, is this the same Bruce Eckel that wrote Thinking in C++ and Thinking in Java, and now came out with a new book? Yeah, that's what I've done before, but this has sort of changed my challenge in life. More or less away from programming languages and towards a meta problem of how do we not just design computer programs, but how do we design businesses so that they are really fun to work for. The slides that I have here are really just my talking points, and I've added these paintings to stimulate your brain, to give you something to look at, because you can read these things. The words on the slides are just for my own help to keep me on track. Although I've intended to make the slides readable, the presentation is on the O'Reilly site, but unfortunately just the words, because the images made the slide deck too large to upload, so the words are there anyway. You will find some other versions of this talk on the web that have been videotaped. I think the last one I gave was at CERN in Switzerland, and it's kind of a nice thing, but it's completely different than what I'm talking about here because that was 2 years ago, and my learning has continued to evolve. So the big question is, how can I take what I've learned from these various experiences that I've had? Here's a picture I took at Burning Man, and I thought it was kind of appropriate because this creature's brain seems to have exploded, and that is the experience that I have when I struggle with this problem. Because we have been acculturated and taught from basically the cradle to sit and listen like you're doing now, and pay attention and do what the boss tells you to do. Because our school systems are designed to create people to work in factories, basically robots. Now we have real robots who are manufacturing things. A surprise to many people is that The United States is still the #1 manufacturer in the world. It's just that we don't have the manufacturing jobs because robots are doing them. So, but our school systems are still turning out robots. So what do? I've been putting on open spaces events for maybe 10 years, and that completely changes your view of what an event like this can be, because it's all discussions and no lectures at all. I've gone to Burning Man 4 or 5 times. It's been a while since I've been visiting companies. I've taken tons of workshops over the years, a lot of them at Esalen, which is kind of my version of a vacation. Various different travels and exploration and consulting experiences over the years. But my goal is to figure out how to create some kind of organization where, first of all, people love to be there. Wouldn't that solve tons of problems? We are exceptionally creative and productive, and people want to contribute to the organization. It's not about what does the organization give me. I love this organization so much that how do I contribute to it? That's the way, for example, this conference, the Java Posse Roundup that we do, people feel ownership of it and they want to contribute to it. How do we do that in the business world? And the reason that the idea came to me initially is because during these open spaces conferences, people started saying, I would like to work for an organization that works like one of these conferences does. All right, cognitive science. I put this up here because I saw an infographic that says that if you put up a slide that contains a brain scan and that mentions cognitive science, people will believe you more in what you say. Nonetheless, this has been part of my studies. It's very helpful to figure out the way your brain fools you. There's a great quote that says, the mind is a machine for jumping to conclusions, and a good book is this Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for that or for something similar. Because a lot of what I've discovered is that my brain naturally doesn't, it's kind of unable to think about certain solutions. It just blocks it until somehow I break through it. And it usually requires some kind of an experience or even a workshop or something like that. The cognitive science helps explain the state of, and I put quotes around science for management science because this goes back to, we'll talk about this guy a little later who kind of messed things up about 100 years ago by being a greedy individual, and management has been following that ever since. There's also, some of you have probably experienced the so-called Dunning-Kruger effect, where people tend to, who are not very skilled, tend to way overestimate their skill level, whereas as you develop more and more skill, you tend you realize how complicated things are, and so you start saying, well, no, I'm not actually that skilled, when you're more skilled than the people who are overestimating their skill. Anyway, that's one of the ways that the brain tricks you. There's confirmation bias, where you look for something that agrees with what you already believe, rather than looking for stuff that might prove you wrong. I have felt that. I have actually gone, if I'm backed into a corner a little bit, I'll actually go looking for confirmation bias, but at least I'm conscious of it now. I'm going, lovely confirmation bias. It feels so good. There's a book which some of you have probably seen, either the TED Talk or there's an RSA Animate, which is really great, about this Dan Pink's book, Drive. And basically in that, he shows that using money as a carrot or a stick produces more productivity, but only in menial jobs. I was going to say meaningless jobs, but I meant menial jobs. So if you say, dig faster, I'll give you more money, people dig faster. They can make that, or put more sprockets on posts, I'll give you more money. But as soon as it becomes a creative thing, when you offer somebody more money to think better, it actually poisons their experience. And my own theory is that is it because it reduces this creative experience to filthy lucre, and you react to that by going, I'm not going to respond positively to that incentive. And they have been doing these studies since the 40s, and again, it shows that using money as the carrot or stick to get people to work better actually produces negative results. Managers know this, they see the studies, but when push comes to shove, it's really hard to unglue ourselves from that way of doing things. They can't unstick themselves from that approach. And only perhaps the most conscious ones do. But then what do you do instead? It's really hard to say. Do you say, we'll give you free food like Google does? Well, they have a different motivation for that. But it's really difficult to say. And in my own experience, I didn't really care about how much I was making when I was working in a job. What I cared about was the experience of being there. So if you improve the experience of being there, that's what will make me want to work more. What Dan Pink shows in his book is what we really want is autonomy, mastery, and purpose. We want to feel like we're steering our own boat. We want to feel like we're getting better at what we're doing, and we want to feel like there's a higher purpose, which is one of the things that a lot of companies never reach. They might get autonomy and mastery, but if you're working for example, when I was at the Python conference and they had a job fair, I walked around trying to get a feel of each of the things and each of the companies, and the ones that worked on Wall Street and their thing was to try and tweak their algorithms so that they could extract more money from the economy. That did not give me any feeling of higher purpose. I did not feel like I would be improving the world by participating in that company, for example. We want to be happy in our work. And it turns out, studies have shown that happy employees produce more profit. It seems to make sense. We know this as people. Managers, we can't seem to remember, or we can't seem to figure out how to implement it. It becomes difficult when anything has any layer of complexity to actually implement it. But I also think that the incentives in the business world tend to be misaligned. When you come out of MBA school, which I'll talk about MBA school momentarily, there was one study done by the Aspen Institute that showed where they surveyed people going into MBA school and then coming out. And what they found going in, they typically wanted to do things like make the world a better place. They had higher aspirations. When they came out, they had been trained to maximize quarterly profits. That was pretty much uniformly what had happened. So you can look at business schools as possibly being the reason for so much damage in the world. Science is, I studied physics as an undergraduate and engineering as a grad. And only recently have I been really starting to understand what science is about. I was, who knows what was going on then. One of the really interesting things about science is people are fond of saying that science explains this. It turns out that science does not explain anything. All it does is establish causality. It says, when this thing happens, this thing happens. And every experiment that we've done so far shows that every time this happens, this happens. Every time I drop something, it falls. We don't know why gravity works. All we know is that it works. We have an equation for it. We can see how things fall, but we don't know what it does. We can break it down into smaller and smaller granularity. We maybe talk about fields or particles being exchanged or whatever, and maybe that'll work, maybe it won't. Science can only disprove things. It can never prove anything. All it can say is, so far, every time we've done this, this has happened. So it's a pretty fascinating way of looking at things. Economics is, they try to be a science. And it is true, when things happen in our environment, we react to them. But the primary conceit of economics is that they can somehow predict and control what's going on, that they can come up with an equation that you can turn the knobs on this thing and say improve productivity or profits or something like that. In my perspective, there is only one law that is absolutely true in economics, and that is the law of unintended consequences. This does not mean it is not worth trying things out. It's definitely worth trying things out. It's worth studying economics and listening to what they say, but you have to go in with a very skeptical ear. As soon as they say, well, of course we know when this happens, your little red flags have to go up. You have to realize that, okay, this is the conceit of the economist. So it's good to try things out, but don't pretend that economics is a science. It's great to study that stuff. Now, when we start looking at the idea of an MBA, for example, or business schools in general, business schools take the ideas of economics and treat them as science, and they say, okay, now we're the engineering. We're going to set up the knobs that you can turn to get more productivity out of your employees and more profit out of your company. And we promise that, we have this all under control, so we can do that. And this came from this fellow named Frederick Winslow Taylor, who around the turn of the last century declared himself the father of scientific management. And he did so by creating a bunch of, several experiments, the most famous of which are called time and motion studies, where what he did was he completely controlled the inputs of his experiment to produce the desired results and declared this to be science. And he also established a foundation for other people to follow. I don't mean foundation as in an institute, but he said, he basically taught other people, well, this is how you do business, is you decide what your results should be, and then you tweak your inputs until you get your result. And this has progressed throughout the last century. There are, So 11,000 new business books are published every year. Most of these people are simply trying to establish themselves as consultants. Every once in a while, a business book will come out that makes an impact, one of which was, maybe 20 years ago or so, a book called In Search of Excellence. And in that book, that was an extremely, probably the most popular business book at least it had ever occurred. Now, the way they did that was they were sitting at their kitchen table and they said, what characteristics would make an excellent company? And they wrote down a list of those characteristics. And then they said, what companies do the things in this list? And then we'll choose 10 of those and we'll put them in our book and we'll say, here's how you achieve excellence. You do these things and see these companies have done these things and they have achieved excellence. The book was a tremendous success, and in somewhere between 5 and 10 years, 7, I believe, if I've got the number correct, 7 of those companies were out of business. To their credit, they wrote a follow-up book where they kind of explained all this. They kind of came clean about it. So at least they did that. But in the meantime, there's a bunch of people saying, well, see, look, cause and effect. You do these things, you get an excellent company. Turns out they just made it up because that's what Taylor did. The book, if you are thinking about getting an MBA, the book to read first is The Management Myth by Matthew Stewart. Now, I wrote a blog post on this on Reinventing Business, and you can go look it up. But basically, Stewart first got his PhD in philosophy, where you learn to dissect arguments. Okay, he got sucked into a management firm, did that for a while, saw the insides and outs, then left and wrote this book where he dissects everything very carefully and precisely of the business world. And I found that to be more illuminating than just about anything. After you read that book, you probably won't want to get an MBA. All right. So the question is, all right, how do I educate myself? How do you educate yourself if you're interested in figuring out a better way of doing business? Because if you go through the MBA process, you're probably just going to learn the way of doing things from the last millennium, which is effectively the feudal system. And I'm not joking about that. If you think about how companies are organized, the person at the top is the Lord, and you are typically somewhere down in the fiefdom. So an MBA might cost, if you look at all the numbers, and I mean, some of them actually do cost $200,000 and more, but if you accumulate all the tests, the costs and the opportunity costs and everything, it's probably $200,000 or something like that. Now, is there a better way you could learn by using that money? Could you spend a lot less and learn a lot more? There's personalmba.com where he talks about hacking your own MBA. One of the things that the MBA schools talk about is networking. You get to meet all these great people who happen to be in your program because whatever program you ended up in. The argument is, well, there's maybe 10 programs where you really meet the top quality people, and the rest of them are whoever shows up at that program. And instead, wouldn't it make more sense? I mean, the conversations that I've had so far at this conference have been extremely enlightening. Wouldn't it make sense to go to conferences and find events, find workshops, visit businesses, and produce your own better networking under your own control rather than what the business school chooses to accept and limit you to? So, what have I achieved so far? Well, I've come up with some organizational design principles, just essentials that I think are really important for any organization that's going to try and be different. One of the things is transparency. Be as honest and clear as possible about absolutely everything. And you see some businesses that are doing this, and one example is, I've had some small experiences in the town that I live with the movie theater, an interesting story there. The business that I refer to transparency about is the local bookstore. We have a very seasonal business in Crested Butte. In the summer, it's just jamming. And the people who are only working there in the summer, they think they're being cheated because they're hardly being paid anything to work in this bookstore coffee shop. They don't understand that the rest of the year is very lean times. So what they did, I suggested transparency. What the owners did is they showed everybody, here's what our business looks like throughout the year. It completely changed the perspective of the people working there. They suddenly became very grateful to be working there at all because they saw how difficult it was to run the company. They realized, yeah, this organization is just getting by pretty much, and so the fact that I can work here at all is a great thing. When I talk about alignment, I'm referring to do our goals and, in a sense, our what's a good example of alignment? When you're not working at cross purposes, when you're not fighting each other to get something done. Say in the software world, if people aren't introducing bugs at one end and trying getting them out in the other. There's a lot of other examples of alignment, but basically it's effectively, are we all rowing in the same direction? That's kind of a rough idea. Preferring goals to controls is talking about saying, let's say where we want to go rather than trying to force people to move in that direction. If somebody is constantly moving in the other direction, then that's a deeper problem, but it's not going to be solved in either way by micromanaging people. So setting the goal rather than trying to control people, I think, is really important. And the feedback loop is essential. In other words, getting the information back. Somehow all of this information needs to be fed back into the system so that we can change it. Consistency, I think, is self-explanatory. It's really interesting to see, when you read the business press, you get a very narrow view as we get through most presses. And they do a lot of reinforcing of their own beliefs. So if something doesn't fit, if something might be successful but doesn't fit into their belief system, they simply don't talk about it. For example, the failure rate of companies is tremendous. Roughly 10% fail every year. The average lifespan has been about 60 years, even big corporations. average lifespan of 60 years, and that's actually been getting shorter, probably because of all the stuff that's been going on with the computers and the internet. So another example is the W.L. Gore Company, which was started in the late 50s with a very different structure, very, very flat, not a high organization, not a pyramid like we see mostly. And it's extremely successful. It did over $5 billion each of the last few years. But it's such a different organization, and people are very happy to work there, and they just kind of go in and never come out. You don't hear much about it in the business press because it doesn't fit with the way they see the world. One of the great podcasts that I've listened to, pretty much every single one of them, my co-author Diane turned me on to this, is the Stanford Entrepreneurial Thought Leader podcast. And they bring in these people, mostly from the Bay Area, but often other places. And they're usually entrepreneurs, sometimes venture capitalists, sometimes various other things. And they give a presentation, and they give their view of the world and why they were successful. And it all sounds very plausible until you go to the next lecture and you hear somebody give a very different view. And there's only one or two where they had enough experience to say, you know, there's a lot of luck involved, and there's only a few things here that seem consistent across company startups. So, but I found that to be very enlightening because it made you realize how easy it is to think that your success comes from something, well, some causal relationship that you are in control of, that you understand. There certainly probably is a number of causal relationships, but you don't necessarily know what they are. You're not necessarily aware of them, or if you're not aware of them, you can't be in control of them. But I find that one in particular to be very valuable to listen to, especially if you're thinking of doing a startup. Nicholas Taleb wrote a book called The Black Swan, where he talks about probability in a very different way. He just recently produced a book called Anti-Fragile, and he talks about how to be lucky. And I thought that, I don't know, for some reason this really resonated with me. What you want to do is take lots of risks that will mostly fail, but set it up so that when one succeeds, the potential upside is very large. But just plan to fail most of the time. But when you fail, don't set it up so that it doesn't take you under. So small, relatively safe risks, but when things coincide, so basically you're planning your luck. You're planning to be ready for luck. Warren Buffett does the same kind of thing. But keep in mind that the so-called overnight success may take 7 to 10 years. All right, here's an important book, Clay Shirky's Here Comes Everybody. Now, he's talking about social networking, but he looks at it in terms of the way the organizations are created and how they work. And one of the things that he said in that really struck me, because I was struggling with the whole idea of why do we have the hierarchy? Why does the average CEO make 400 times more than the line workers? All this kind of crazy stuff that we see today. He said that the reason for the hierarchy is for communication. And of course, we're talking about something that has existed for, at least hundreds of years. Now we have the internet, so we have a different way and more effective way of communicating. But we still have the hierarchy, of course. And one of the real problems with this, and that's what I created with this little diagram, is you can see each person, each face is one person. Each of these two faces is one person. And the bottom one is receiving the information. He's a little skeptical. But when he's talking to his supervisor, he unconsciously makes it a little more cheerful. This is a known phenomenon. When somebody is in a power position above you, naturally, it's a tribal, survival thing. You want to make them happy. So you tweak the information unconsciously to make it a little happier. And as it goes up this hierarchy, it gets happier and happier until it gets to the top, to the CEO. CEO's going, everything's great. And I think the effect also works on the way down. I think it's something like, say, overconfident. So as the information goes down, it's like, yeah, we know everything, we're in control of everything. That, Shirky didn't talk about that. That's my own assertion. He was talking about it going upward. The culture that you have reinforces your structure. And this is a very difficult Gordian knot, because your culture comes, most companies, I've talked to a number of companies where they say, well, we've gotten to a certain size, maybe we're 500 people now or something. So now it's time to start putting our culture in place. We're going to design our culture. And my friend Barry Hawkins put it very well when he said, culture cannot be spoken into existence. Your culture, by the time you get some employees, your culture is already forming. By the time you get 500 employees, your culture is in place. Your culture is chosen by who you choose to work for you, who they choose to work for them. And on top of that, once you create your culture, you think you're choosing from among all possibilities, but you're only choosing from the people that show up, who are actually interested in working for the culture that you have created. There's a whole bunch of other people who look at that from afar and say, no, I'm not even interested in going near that. So this is a very tight coupling, and I think perhaps that the first thing that people need to think about when they're creating an organization is, what is our culture? And not, what product are we creating? Or how much, what is our business model? How are we going to make a profit? I think maybe if you're going to have a culture, if you're going to design a culture, you have to design it first off. That has to be, and we see some examples of this, like, for example, when Guido van Rossum started creating the Python culture, it was very important to him that people be nice to each other. And so he surrounded himself with people who were nice and reinforced that idea, and they propagated that idea out into the community. And that's the primary, well, I mean, I like the language, but one of the main things that keeps drawing me back into Python is I really like the culture of the community. It's super important to me, the way that works. Hiring and firing, this is a question that keeps coming back to me. For my friends who are running these little businesses, they go, man, this is really tough. How do we do this? Interviews are a terrible way of figuring out. All you really learn from interviews is how good or bad are people at interviewing. You don't really know anything about how they're working. So one of the great things about the open source movement is we learn from people's actual work how good they are at doing something. You certainly don't learn everything about them. And one of the really important things that are often put on a second tier is the cultural fit. How well do people fit into your company on a personal level? Because cultural debt is more expensive, I think, than technical debt. We can train technical debt away. When somebody comes in and they're a toxic person, the damage that causes can be irreparable. And we have systems now that require maybe a year before you can get rid of a toxic person. And that's terrible. This is why Netflix is so aggressive about that. They say, we can, if we discover you're not a good fit, we'll give you a nice little severance package and you're out. Because they understand mostly the problems with toxic individuals. So this is a super tough one, but it feels like something that needs to be completely turned on its head, much like an open spaces conference is such a completely different approach to conferences than an eyes forward one like this. Many of you may be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He talks about the development of a human based on as they achieve each level, they move on to the next level, and the goal is to reach this level of where we don't have prejudice, we accept facts, and we're looking for spontaneity and creativity and that sort of thing. We work our way up to that. Based on that, I came up with kind of an organizational hierarchy of needs. This is a rough guess. It's not perfect or scientific or anything. It's just my guess as to what it should look like. And at the top, what we're looking for is something that is best for everyone, not just the organization, not just the employees in the organization, but everyone, including the customers, the environment, all of those things. And it's not an unreasonable goal to try and achieve. One of the things I mentioned going to, at least I think, no, I talked to somebody else about that. One of the things that I started doing, I was passing through Las Vegas, and I thought, I had read Tony Hsieh's book, and he mentioned that Zappos has these tours. And I thought, oh, what the heck, I'll take a tour. And it was very eye-opening for me. I thought, I've learned so much on this tour. The experience has been very... Anyway, it's been amazing to go on this experience and see that. And I highly recommend, if you're in Las Vegas, take half a day, go on the tour. It doesn't matter whether you agree or disagree with what they're doing, but the experience of taking the tour will open your eyes, I think. It was really educational, and it made me start wondering, how can you get an MBA without visiting companies? I don't know. I know some programs do a little bit of that, but to me, this has become an essential part of what I do. When I travel, I try and visit companies, people I know, or any other connection that I can get. There needs to be a way to change the system by the people within it. And one of the things that I did recently, this last spring, is I took a seminar on this thing called holacracy. And that gave me a lot of new insights and new ways of thinking about things. And with holacracy, he questions everything, including things like deadlines. Everybody knows deadlines don't work. They're just this arbitrary thing because somebody wants to know when something's going to be done, but it never seems to work out. So the guy who created holacracy said, hey, let's not have deadlines. And now I can't remember. I've been trying to dig it back up. Okay, what are we doing instead of deadlines? But it's something sensible. But it's that level of re-engineering of how an organization works. But one of the most essential things about holacracy is it made me realize, because I was just looking for a new rubber stamp. We replaced the feudal system with a new system, and we just stamped that onto all the new companies. What holacracy made me realize is every company is different. Every company needs to grow its own structure. Oh, wow. And again, I realized, I had that barrier in my brain that kept me from thinking about that. So you can go to this site and learn more about it. I can't, I'm starting to run out of time, so I'm not going to go into detail. But I highly recommend looking at that just because it will seriously change the way you think about how organizations can be structured. One of the things that I'm doing now is I've started visiting hacker spaces, a little bit of co-working spaces, and there's a group of us in Crested Butte that are investigating the possibility of creating an incubator there. So now, in fact, later this afternoon, I'm going over to, there's an open house at the Portland Incubator Experiment, I think is what it's called. And so, in fact, some of you may not want to come to that. I think it starts at... I think it goes from 4:30 to 6:30. And so I'm going to learn about incubators now, and when I travel, try and visit them to see if it's something, an incubator or something like it is something that we'll be able to create in Crested Butte, which is, yes, it's a little town out in the middle of nowhere, but it's beautiful. So some people will want to come be in an incubator there. And we might do things like, say, instead of a normal incubator that kind of, it's a bit more of a shotgun approach, we might say, well, we have a lot of Scala expertise. So maybe our incubatees will all work within certain technologies, and then they can share information more. And, perhaps if one project doesn't work, those people can go work on another project. There could be some great benefits from tweaking that model. So one of the most, the rewiring of the brain that I'm doing is the fact that struggling with all of these preconceived notions that I often don't even know are there can be a bit exhausting. And I feel like I'm slowly adapting to it. It feels like I'm growing new brain cells and opening some boundaries that I've had. But but I have to be careful to see any sort of assumptions. I have to question them. I have to use maybe my scientific background to question them, and the background that I've had in computer programming to really analyze and understand what's going on here. One of the Occam's razor ideas that came up to me, perhaps this is a test for whether an organization is going in the right direction or not, is does it try and control you, or is it trying to help you maximize creativity? All right, here are some links. Some of the, and again, all of this stuff is on the website, on the OSCON website. You can download. You won't get the images, unfortunately, because they made it too big, but you'll get the text. So that's the essence of it. And we are out of time, but we can have a hallway discussion afterwards if you want, and I'll be around until they're interviewing me on the show floor, I think at 4:30, and then I'll be heading over to the incubator. So thank you for coming. And I guess, can we take questions at all? Who's in charge of this? Oh. Okay, I am. Well, until I get thrown out, I can take questions. So, if there are any. I can take a couple of questions, he said. Okay, yes. You know, that's really interesting, because I see, when you look at an incubator, you go, oh, instead of the school saying, give us your money and we'll tell you what to do, and if you succeed, that's great, but if you don't, we don't really care because we got your money. With an incubator, the incubator is investing in the team, and if the team succeeds, then the incubator gets money back, and if they don't, well, so there's an example of alignment. They have a great alignment in trying to make the teams succeed. And I met with Michelle Rowley, who created this group called Code Scouts, and here in Portland, and she's almost looking at it in the same way of trying to, instead of incubating teams, she's like looking at incubating individuals. But I think it's a very interesting idea because it forces the educational institute, whatever it is, to think about their success and they couple it with the success of the individual. And so I think, however we do it, we need to move in that direction. I don't know if the incubator will be the be-all, end-all of that. I'm still just learning about them. This will be my first one. Yes? Yeah, challenges for less than 20 developers. Yeah, well, first of all, I don't have any rules yet. These are all just ideas. Yeah, well, there is this well-known, okay, there's these certain numbers that you hit when everything changes and you need to start hiring MBAs and grow up and become adults and things like that, which I think is an artifact of the last millennium style of organizing people. And so I'm kind of suspicious of that. And one of the things that I notice about holacracy is that it doesn't seem to have those. It's kind of a continuous process. Every time an issue comes up, you address it. Anytime somebody has a tension, that's considered a data point that we don't ignore. We don't just go, hey, suck it up and join the team. We say, oh, what's going wrong here? We need to adapt the organization to adjust to the tension. And to me, that doesn't seem to matter. The size of the organization doesn't matter in that case. And so I feel like it shouldn't, and this is just intuition, I feel like it shouldn't be based on how many people you have. It should work with 2 or 3 people or 500 people or more. But I'm still collecting information. I don't have answers as much as questions. Yes? So Culture is what we're able to transfer using artifacts of, well, using, from mind to mind is what culture is. If we learn by, say, dying or not dying because something runs over us or it doesn't, then that's like Darwinian selection. Culture is, I'm able to say, oh, don't cross the street when there's a vehicle coming because you'll get crushed. It's the kind of mental things that get transferred. So a lot of your culture, your kind of base culture, comes from your parents, from your school, from any other organizations that you internalize the information from. And so a lot of times when an employee, say if we're thinking of an employee situation, employee comes to you, they have a lot of culture already. So when you're trying to figure out whether they're going to fit within your culture, you have to, say even something as simple as, how do you feel about continuous integration and testing and things like that? How do you because if they don't fit within that culture, if they're going to fight that, that's going to cause a lot of problems. That's going to, and that, whether they do it or not, probably goes back to their earlier experiences, which you don't usually have much control over. So mostly you can just detect whether they're going to be a cultural fit or not. And those are the kinds of tests and experiments that you want to do with a person when you're considering bringing them into your culture. But looked at that way, how do you engineer a culture is pretty much just who's going to be on our team and do their cultural values fit with ours. Yes? Absolutely. Yeah, this is why none of this is simple, and yet it's a wonderful mental exercise. Yes, and even more than that, look at what the Santa Fe Project has done. They intentionally take people from completely different disciplines and stick them right next to each other because the results are so much more creative when you have people from different viewpoints, and that's what you want. So it's like, yeah, how do you balance, Are you a fit versus are you just creatively different? Are you going to cause us to go backwards, or are you going to bring us in a different direction that we actually want to go into? It's like, oh, wow, how do you, yes, oh, totally, excellent observation. Yeah, all of this stuff is so different from the determinism of computer programming, where it's just a matter of getting the bits to go in the right direction. We're dealing with, and this is why we can't have knobs to turn, and we can't. It's an art. It is totally an art. And like I say, I have many more questions than answers, but I'm getting okay with that. I just keep imagining, okay, what would it look like to see a company where I want to go? I'm kind of the ultimate customer because I pretty much don't like anybody to tell me anything, and yet I want to be creative and I want to interact with people. Yes? Do you think it's possible for a large organization to turn around? Wow. I have struggled with that problem. There are people who say that it's possible. Brian, who created Holacracy, he believes it is possible, but I wonder if he isn't fooling himself. I don't know, I keep coming back to thinking, maybe it's possible. The effort involved and the engineering would be so huge. I think it would be so clever and subtle. I think larger organizations can make small changes, but I don't know if they can make really fundamental changes. I wonder if what we're talking about requires a green field to actually achieve. I don't know. I'm skeptical. In the back, Oh, yes. Actually, there's I can't remember the name of it, but it's like Conways Law or something. Is that I think it might even be Conway's Law, that says that your architecture looks like your team. It ends up looking like your team, which is kind of mind-boggling and twisting, and yes.
You talked a lot about hierarchy structure. What about ownership structure? Or cooperatives?
Well, yeah, and my friend Kate is an artist, and she's created what she wanted to be a cooperative, and the problem is that everybody goes, oh, this is your company, and if I don't do something, you'll take care of it, and if the money falls short, you'll come up with the money. Yeah, I've been looking at cooperatives, and I lived in a co-housing community for, I can't remember how many, maybe 3 or 4 years, and learned a lot about things like, consensus. And I saw, yeah, consensus, you got to be really careful about that. And that's one of the things that I like about holacracy is instead of saying everybody's got to agree on everything, the idea is that as long as you can't come up with a legitimate objection, and they have ways to pick apart and understand, is this a legitimate objection or it isn't, then we go ahead and try the experiment to see if it fixes the tension. And with that kind of lightweight decision-making process, it allows you, when you go through consensus, at least when we did it in co-housing, it was like, oh my God, I never want to think about that decision again. So if it doesn't work out, we're just host. Whereas with holacracy, the decision-making process is quick and lightweight enough, and the idea is this is just an experiment. We can always revisit it if it's not working and try and come up with something else. Really different approach. Also, they're distributing power. So roles and accountabilities are distributed so that the decisions can be made very quickly. And I wonder if something like that maybe if you did something like that, it might not fit the idea of a collective. But there were people at that seminar who were part of the Oakland food project or something, which seemed to be a very collective kind of thing, and they were trying to implement it, and they were going back and doing that. So I guess it depends on your definition of a collective and whether something like holacracy would violate that. Yes.
A lot of what you're talking about requires a level of self-awareness. I think we're inherently selfish. How do we deal with our self-awareness?
Yeah, there's not only are we, I don't know. The child is the most selfish, but if you see the growth pattern of a child, they become more and more aware of people around them, and eventually may reach a state of enlightened self-interest where they realize if they help the people around them, they will also benefit. And there are these, there are these stages of life. And so I think if we say, oh yeah, we're inherently selfish as a flat statement, I think you're missing that arc of development. In fact, I just listened to an RSA presentation where the guy talks about several more stages of adult development that we've only started seeing because we're living long enough for this to appear in a fraction of these adults, where you can hold two opposing ideas in your head at the same time, comfortably, reasonably comfortably anyway. And that's like this stage of development. And I think maybe, I don't know. I mean, for me, I look at this and say, I want to work in a happy environment, and that only works if everybody around me is happy. It's not about me. If I have to be CEO, I don't want to be the CEO who's king and gets all the money. I want to be the CEO who loves to come to work because everyone is around him is happy. And I feel like maybe it's just there are different people. There are psychopaths, and they often end up at the top of in the C-level things. The higher percentage, we see a higher percentage of psychopaths in the C-level of organizations because they want that power. And one of the things that I think we need to change if we're going to create happy organizations is somehow make the organization so it is simply not interesting to psychopaths. They look at it and they go, I see no advantage for me there, I'm going elsewhere. And I go, yes, that's what we want. So I'm not sure if, anyway, I think you need to add that other dimension to really see the possibilities. I hope that makes sense.